The auctioneer's hammer fell with a finality that echoed through the nearly empty livestock barn. But nobody raised their hand for lot 47. The skeletal chestnut mare stood in the corner pen, her ribs visible beneath a dull, matted coat, one eye clouded with cataracts, and her left hind leg bearing the scars of some long-ago injury. That had healed poorly. She was 23 years old, blind in one eye, and deemed worthless by every rancher, trainer, and horse dealer who had walked past her stall that morning. Going once, going twice for $25, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying more resignation than hope. Anyone at all? Cordelia Whitmore sat in the back row of the weathered bleachers, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather purse. At 72, she had been widowed for 3 years, living alone on the small ranch her late husband Jeremiah had left her. In the rolling hills of Montana, the other bidders had long since focused their attention on the younger, healthier horses. But Cordelia's eyes had remained fixed on the forgotten mare. Something stirred in her chest as she watched the horse, a recognition of shared abandonment, perhaps, or simply the stubbornness that had carried her through 7 decades of prairie winters and personal losses. She thought of her empty barn, of the silence that had settled over her property like dust, and of the way Jeremiah used to say that every creature deserved a chance to prove its worth. $50, Cordelia called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The auctioneer's head snapped up in surprise. $50 from the lady in the back. Do I hear 60? The barn fell silent except for the shuffling of hooves and the distant lowing of cattle. The other bidders turned to stare at the elderly woman who had just offered twice the asking price for what they considered a liability on 4 legs, sold to the lady in the back for $50. The auctioneer announced, bringing his hammer down with considerably more enthusiasm than before. As Cordelia made her way to the payment window, she could hear the whispers following her. What's she planning to do with that old nag? Probably just buying herself a grave to dig. Should have put it out of its misery years ago. But Cordelia had learned long ago to ignore the opinions of people who confused age with worthlessness. She completed the paperwork with steady hands, arranging for the horse to be delivered to her ranch the following morning. The mare would be called Juniper. She decided after the hardy trees that somehow managed to thrive in the harsh Montana landscape, despite everyone expecting them to fail. That night, Cordelia sat on her porch, watching the stars emerge over the familiar silhouette of the mountains. She thought about the horse that would soon share her solitude, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than the hollow ache of loss. Tomorrow, she would have a purpose beyond simply existing. Tomorrow, she would begin the slow work of healing both the horse and herself. The wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other. Across the valley, somewhere in that vast darkness, Cordelia felt the first stirrings of hope she had experienced since Jeremiah's funeral. Juniper arrived the next morning in a trailer that had seen better decades, her head hanging low as she was led into the small paddock beside Cordelia's barn. The horse moved with the careful gait of someone who had learned to expect pain with each step, and her good eye darted nervously at every shadow and sound. Cordelia watched from the fence rail, noting how the mare's ears swiveled constantly, compensating for her blindness with heightened awareness of everything around her. The horse was thin to thin, but beneath the neglect, Cordelia could see the ghost of noble lines. The suggestion of the beautiful animal Juniper had once been. Well, girl, Cordelia murmured, keeping her voice low and steady, I suppose we're both starting over. The first weeks were challenging. Juniper flinched at sudden movements and refused to eat when anyone was watching. Cordelia would leave fresh hay and oats in the paddock, then retreat to her kitchen window to observe from a distance. Slowly, meal by meal, the horse began to fill out, her coat gradually taking on a healthier sheen under Cordelia's patient care. Dr. Maverick Holloway, the local veterinarian, made house calls to examine Juniper's old injuries and prescribe supplements for her joints. She's got good bones, he admitted grudgingly, running his hands along the mare's legs. Whatever happened to her, she's tougher than she looks. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Juniper began to trust. She would approach the fence when Cordelia called, accepting gentle touches and eventually allowing herself to be brushed. The mare's coat revealed itself to be a rich chestnut with flecks of copper that caught the light. Like scattered pennies, Cordelia established routines that both she and Juniper came to depend upon. Morning feedings at dawn, grooming sessions in the afternoon, and quiet evening conversations over the paddock fence. The horse became an eager listener. Her ears pricked forward whenever Cordelia spoke about her grandchildren, who lived 3 states away, or shared memories of Jeremiah, and the dreams they had built together on this land. "You know," Cordelia said one evening as she stroked Juniper's neck, "I think we're good medicine for each other." The horse nickered softly in response, nuzzling Cordelia's shoulder with surprising gentleness. For the first time since her husband's death, Cordelia felt the deep satisfaction of being needed. She had purpose again, and Juniper had hope by winter's first snowfall. The transformation was remarkable. Juniper had gained weight and muscle, her coat gleaming with health. More importantly, she had regained something that couldn't be measured in pounds or veterinary charts. She had rediscovered her dignity. The way she carried herself, the alert intelligence in her good eye, the quiet confidence in her movements all spoke of a horse who remembered she was worth saving. Cordelia had changed too. The crushing loneliness that had followed her husband's death had lifted, replaced by the daily joy of caring for another living creature. She slept better, laughed more often, and found herself looking forward to each new day with Juniper. Neither woman nor horse could have predicted that this healing would soon prove to be more than comfort. It would become preparation for the trial that lay ahead. Spring arrived with a phone call that changed everything. Cordelia's daughter, Vivian, was calling from Denver with news that made the elderly woman's heart race with both joy and concern. "Mom, I know this is short notice, but could Stellan stay with you for the summer? The divorce is getting uglier, and I think she needs to be away from all the fighting." Stellan was Cordelia's 12-year-old granddaughter, a spirited girl with auburn hair and her grandmother's stubborn streak. Cordelia hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, not since the family dynamics had become strained by her son-in-law's drinking and the subsequent marital problems. "Of course she can stay," Cordelia replied without hesitation. "When can you bring her?" "Actually, I was hoping to drive her up this weekend. I'm sorry to dump this on you, but you're not dumping anything on me, honey. I'd love to have her." 3 days later, Stellan arrived with a duffel bag, a sketchbook, and an expression of barely contained anger that reminded Cordelia of herself at that age. The girl was all knees and elbows, caught in that awkward phase between childhood and adolescence, and her eyes held a wariness that no 12-year-old should possess. "Hi, Grandma," Stellan said, submitting to a hug but remaining rigid in Cordelia's embrace. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm so glad you're here." Stellan's gaze immediately found Juniper, who was grazing peacefully in the paddock. "You got a horse?" "I did. Her name is Juniper. Would you like to meet her?" The girl's entire demeanor shifted. The careful mask of indifference slipped away, replaced by genuine curiosity. "Can I?" The helicopter landed on a hill overlooking the flood zone, where Pike coordinated with ground crews who were already working to rescue stranded livestock. Throughout the valley, it took 3 hours and the combined efforts of multiple agencies. But finally, a specialized team was able to reach the barn with a boat and transfer Juniper to safety. When they were finally reunited on dry ground, Stellan threw her arms around Juniper's neck, sobbing with relief. The horse, exhausted but alert, nuzzled the girl gently, as if to reassure her that they were both safe. "That horse saved your lives," Pike told Cordelia as they watched the reunion. "If she hadn't kept calling like that, we would have flown right past. Her voice was the only thing that led us to you." Cordelia nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The horse that nobody had wanted, the animal that others had written off as worthless, had proven to be worth more than anyone could have imagined. 3 months after the flood, Cordelia's ranch was slowly returning to normal. The house had been repaired, the barn rebuilt, and Juniper had a new paddock with higher fencing and better drainage. But the changes went deeper than mere reconstruction. The flood had transformed all of their lives in ways they were still discovering. Stellan had returned to Denver when school started, but she called every evening to check on Juniper and to share the events of her day. The confident, happy girl who had left the ranch bore little resemblance to the angry, withdrawn child who had arrived that spring. Her parents' divorce had been finalized, but Stellan had found the strength to navigate the changes with grace and resilience. "I've been thinking about what you said," Stellan told her grandmother during one of their nightly calls, "about how sometimes we just need one person who believes we're worth saving." "Oh, what about it?" "I think sometimes we need to be that person for someone else, too, like you were for Juniper, and like Juniper was for us." Cordelia smiled, recognizing the wisdom in her granddaughter's words. What are you planning?" "Sweetheart, there's a girl at school, Clementine. She's new, and nobody talks to her because she's different. But I think she's just scared and lonely. I'm going to be her friend." The conversation reminded Cordelia of a decision she had been contemplating for weeks. The next morning, she made a phone call to Dr. Holloway. "Maverick, I've been thinking about starting a program here at the ranch, something for kids who might benefit from spending time with horses. Troubled kids, maybe, or ones who are going through difficult times." "That's a wonderful idea, Cordelia. Equine therapy has shown remarkable results. Do you have the resources for something like that?" "I have the space, and I have Juniper, but I'd need help with the other horses and the program structure." Within 6 months, the Juniper Ranch Recovery Program was welcoming its first participants. The program paired at-risk youth with rescued horses, creating bonds that helped heal both human and animal. Cordelia worked with social workers, therapists, and volunteers to create a safe space where young people could learn responsibility, empathy, and self-worth through caring for animals who had faced their own challenges. Juniper, now 24, and still going strong, became the program's star. Her gentle nature and patient demeanor made her perfect for working with children who had experienced trauma or loss. She seemed to understand that her job was to listen, to comfort, and to demonstrate that survival was possible even after abandonment and pain. On the 1-year anniversary of the flood, Stellan returned for a special celebration. The ranch hosted an open house, welcoming families and community members to see the program in action. Pike Donovan, the helicopter crew chief who had coordinated their rescue, attended with his own daughter, who had become one of the program's regular participants. "You know," Pike said to Cordelia as they watched children grooming horses in the afternoon sun, "I've been in search and rescue for 20 years, but I've never seen anything like what happened that day. That horse didn't just save your lives, she saved your spirits." Cordelia nodded, watching as Stellan worked with a shy 10-year-old boy who was learning to brush Juniper's coat. The mare stood perfectly still, as if she understood the importance of the moment, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle the child's shoulder encouragingly. "I used to think I saved her," Cordelia said quietly, "but I realize now that she saved me first. She gave me purpose when I thought my useful life was over. She taught me that value isn't determined by age or perceived usefulness, it's determined by love and connection." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cordelia reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A horse that nobody wanted had become the heart of a program that was changing lives. A lonely widow had found new purpose. A troubled girl had discovered her strength, and a community had learned that sometimes the most valuable gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Juniper stood in her paddock, her copper coat gleaming in the evening light. Surrounded by the sounds of laughter and hope, she had proven that every creature deserves a chance to show their worth, and in doing so, she had created a legacy that would touch countless lives for years to come. The widow had saved the horse, but in the end, they had all saved each other. Cordelia led her granddaughter to the fence, explaining Juniper's history and the careful process of building trust. Stellan listened intently, her fingers gripping the fence rails as she studied the mare. "She's beautiful," Stellan whispered. "But why is her eye like that?" "She was born with a cataract in that eye. It makes her blind on that side, but she's learned to adapt. She's actually quite remarkable." Juniper approached the fence, drawn by the sound of a new voice. She extended her neck towards Stellan, nostrils flaring as she took in the girl's scent. Without being asked, Stellan remained perfectly still, instinctively understanding that sudden movements might frighten the horse. She likes you," Cordelia observed as Juniper gently nuzzled Stellan's outstretched palm. "How can you tell? See how her ears are forward, and she's choosing to come closer even though you're someone new. That's trust." Over the following days, Stellan spent hours by the paddock, talking to Juniper in the unconscious way that children communicate with animals. She helped with grooming, learned to measure out feed, and listened with rapt attention as Cordelia shared everything she had learned about horse care. "Grandma," Stellan said one evening as they sat on the porch, "do you think Juniper knows that nobody wanted her?" Cordelia considered the question carefully. "I think she knows she was hurt and alone, but I also think she knows that someone finally saw her worth. Sometimes that's all any of us need, one person who believes we're worth saving." Stellan nodded solemnly, and Cordelia suspected they were no longer talking only about the horse. The girl was healing too, finding in Juniper's story a reflection of her own feelings of abandonment and confusion. What neither of them realized was that this healing summer would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The weather had been building for 3 days, that peculiar tension in the air that every Montana rancher learned to recognize. By late July, the heat had become oppressive, the sky taking on a greenish tint that spoke of violent weather ahead. Cordelia watched the clouds gathering over the mountains with growing unease, remembering the flash floods that had devastated the valley 20 years earlier. "Stellan, help me bring Juniper into the barn," she called to her granddaughter, who was sitting in the paddock sketching the mare. "I don't like the look of this sky." The girl had spent 6 weeks on the ranch, and the transformation was remarkable. Her initial sullenness had given way to genuine happiness, and she had formed an extraordinary bond with Juniper. The horse seemed to understand that Stellan needed her friendship, often coming to the fence whenever the girl appeared upset or thoughtful. They had just gotten Juniper settled in her stall when the storm hit with frightening intensity. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning split the sky with increasing frequency. The power went out around midnight, leaving them huddled in the kitchen with battery-powered lanterns and the sound of the wind howling through the eaves. "It's getting worse," Cordelia murmured, checking her weather radio. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. "Flash flood warning for all low-lying areas. Residents are advised to seek higher ground immediately." Cordelia's ranch sat on a gentle slope above Cedar Creek, which had been reduced to a trickle by the summer drought. She had always felt safe from flooding, but as the night wore on and the rain continued with unrelenting fury, she began to hear a sound that made her blood run cold, the roar of rushing water. "Stellan, we need to go upstairs," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "The creek is rising." They gathered emergency supplies and made their way to the second floor, where they could see the front yard through the bedroom window. In the intermittent lightning flashes, Cordelia could see that Cedar Creek had become a raging torrent, already spilling over its banks and creeping toward the house. "What about Juniper?" Stellan asked, her voice tight with worry. "The barn is on higher ground than the house. She should be safe." But even as Cordelia spoke the words, she could see that the flooding was worse than anything in her memory. The water was rising faster than seemed possible, and the barn, while elevated, was not immune to the flood that was transforming the peaceful valley into a churning lake. By 3 in the morning, water had reached the first floor of the house. Cordelia and Stellan were trapped upstairs, watching helplessly as their refuge became an island in the middle of a temporary sea. The sound of rushing water was deafening, punctuated by the crash of debris, tree branches, pieces of fence, and "We're carried along by the flood." "I can't see the barn," Stellan whispered, pressing her face against the window. "Grandma, I can't see the barn." Cordelia put her arms around her granddaughter, but she couldn't offer the comfort of false hope. The barn was indeed invisible in the darkness, and the water was still rising. All they could do was wait and pray that both they and Juniper would survive until dawn. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the storm clouds, the true scope of the disaster became clear. The flood had transformed the entire valley, turning familiar landmarks into isolated islands. The barn was still standing, but water surrounded it, and there was no way to reach it from the house. "We need to get to higher ground," Cordelia said, studying the situation. "The water's starting to come upstairs, but when they looked out the back window, their hearts sank. The flood had cut them off completely, and the water was still rising. As dawn broke over the flooded valley, Cordelia and Stellan found themselves trapped on the second floor of their home, which had become a small island in the middle of a raging torrent. The water had risen to the level of the first-floor windows, and debris swirled past in the current pieces of fence, tree branches, and unidentifiable objects that spoke of the storm's destructive power. "Look, Grandma," Stellan suddenly cried, pointing toward the barn. "Juniper's alive." Through the gray morning light, they could see the mare standing in the barn's upper loft, where the hay was stored. Somehow, she had managed to climb the wooden ramp to the second level as the water rose, and now she stood at the loft's opening, her head extended as she searched for familiar voices. "She's looking for us," Stellan said, tears streaming down her face. "She knows we're in trouble." Cordelia studied the situation with growing alarm. The water was still rising, and even the barn's upper level wouldn't remain safe for long. Worse, their own situation was becoming desperate. The flood had reached the stairs, and they were running out of high ground. "We need to signal for help," Cordelia said, but even as she spoke, she knew the futility of it. The storm had knocked out phone service, and the isolation of their ranch meant that rescue crews would be focused on the towns and more populated areas. That's when Juniper did something extraordinary. The mare began to whinny, not the casual nickering they were used to, but a loud, urgent call that cut through the sound of rushing water. She repeated the call again and again, her voice carrying across the flooded valley with desperate intensity. "What is she doing?" Stellan asked. "I think she's trying to help," Cordelia replied, hardly daring to believe it. For nearly an hour, Juniper continued her urgent calling, and then, impossibly, they heard an answering sound, the rumble of a helicopter approaching from the south. The mare's calls had been heard by a search and rescue team that was conducting aerial reconnaissance of the flood damage. "There," Stellan shouted, waving frantically from the window. "Down here." The helicopter circled the house, its crew assessing the situation. Through the aircraft's loudspeaker, they heard, "We see you. We're going to lower a basket. Stay calm." The rescue was harrowing. The helicopter's rotor wash created additional waves in the floodwater, and the basket swayed dangerously in the wind. But the crew was skilled and experienced, and within 20 minutes, both Cordelia and Stellan were safely aboard the aircraft. "Wait," Stellan cried as the helicopter began to climb. "What about Juniper? We can't leave her." The crew chief, a weathered man named Pike Donovan, looked down at the barn where the horse was still calling out. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we can't lift a horse. Our equipment isn't designed for that kind of rescue." "She saved us," Stellan said, her voice breaking. "She called for help when we couldn't. Please, you have to try." Pike looked at the desperate faces of the grandmother and granddaughter, then at the horse who was still trumpeting her distress calls. Something in the scene moved him in a way that 20 years of rescue work hadn't prepared him for. "I'll radio for a livestock trailer," he said finally. "If we can get close enough to the barn, we might be able to rig something up."